Good morning, everyone. I thought we could spend a few minutes talking about common DevOps practices. As you're probably aware, it's very, very challenging for us to define what DevOps is. But I do believe we've seen enough now in the last 10 years to be able to define how DevOps what it looks like, how it behaves. So let's take a glimpse first at how Spotify looks with its culture. First off, with Spotify, there's an excellent engineering culture video, a series of two that I'll have linked in the footer. But it is very fast-moving squads that are aligned on solving very specific business problems. So right away, we have a very good foundation for a DevOps culture with these very small, fast-moving, mission-oriented teams. The culture is very fail-friendly at Spotify. They focus quite a bit on recovery instead of avoiding failure. It's not about pinning the blame on someone, and they focus really on what we need to learn, what we should change. They do have a consistent definition of done as well. That's important for them because they want to make sure the quality is baked into everything consistently, regardless of the team. They definitely have an objective of throwing things like pride, fear, and ego outside. In other words, being willing to admit when we made a mistake. This is oftentimes what DevOps culture comes down to. Is it safe for me to learn? Because as we all know, learning means making mistakes. And Daniel Ek from Spotify said the same thing. We aim to make mistakes faster than anyone else. So these are autonomous squads that are aligned in tribes, chapters, and guilds. This tribes is really the functional unit, though. These are very small, 2 pizza-sized teams, as we've seen elsewhere, 8 to 12. And then the chapters and guilds helps them align based on function and be able to share information, for instance, among DBAs. But at the same time, make sure that most of people's work is happening at that tribal layer. They do believe very much in high autonomy and the principle of servant leadership. So before we move on there, notice in the lower right the definition of awesome. I thought this was terrific. As far as a consistent definition of done, they want to be able to build, test, and ship in the first week. So I use Spotify quite often in my talks as an example. For you to get something out the door, and that includes continuous integration delivery, right? Your release management tooling in the first week means that we are talking about a true minimum viable product, an MVP, something that you are embarrassed to show your mother, basically like a hello world type program. Really only 3 or 4 hours worth of coding. But here's the key. Use data to improve and release your second time in week 2. This is Spotify's definition of awesome. They may not always make that, but being able to deliver that first version quickly to the customer, that's something that they put a high value on. What do we mean when it comes to actual like servant leadership? Well, first off, they show care. They do measure employees' happiness level. Many times in traditional enterprises, we get we pay these people, $200,000 a year. They shouldn't ever have any problems, But both Microsoft and Spotify care very deeply about the happiness and satisfaction level of their engineers because they know how hard it is to find and retain these people. So for example, there's examples of Spotify saying, listen, we did a survey, 91% of you were happy, 4% of you though said you were unhappy working here. That's not acceptable to us. We're going to fix this. So people oftentimes ask me, what are some good KPIs, some good metrics to measure our happiness level at DevOps? Employee satisfaction is a very good benchmark to keep in mind. Are we going too fast? They do definitely allow a high level of autonomy. They do favor trust over control, but this is not anarchy. They have the managers define the problem. They have the managers define the problem, and then it is up to the teams to determine how they're going to go about it. And innovation for them is far better than predictability. So the values that we see there, we're a team of volunteers working on something we care about. That's definitely Spotify culture. When it comes to automation, again, they favor decoupled releases. These are small autonomous teams. They want releases to be routine, no drama in them, and they talk about release trains. For this, they use things like feature toggles, where everything goes out at the same time. This is something, again, that came up many times in my interviews. The important thing, though, is no queues. This is truly self-service infrastructure. No tickets are generated. Those environments are made available to them through that role of IT, whose job is to kind of enable that framework for self-service, provide some governance. So for them, it's all about finding the right balance between consistency and flexibility. So as the saying goes, like, yes, we want autonomy, right? But let's not sub-optimize. Some things truly are kept centralized there. So they definitely pay a lot of attention to the balance between allowing teams total flexibility and then the benefits that we get from some level of consistency in our tooling. Release trains just means that things are going out on X day. For this, feature flags they found invaluable. They do ring releases and A/B releases the same way that we do at Microsoft. The point there is limiting the blast radius, and this is something we see very commonly with successful organizations around DevOps. They do value very frequent releases, weekly if at all possible. So many times this feature does go out, but because they use feature flags, it's decoupled. The functionality is decoupled from the pattern of release. They do make their work visible. They buy in very heavily into some of the lessons we've learned from Toyota with improvement kata and the principle of Kaizen, identifying waste and exposing technical debt. But they recognize this is definitely a iterative process. Nothing's perfect at Spotify or anywhere. So there's always a target condition they're reaching towards that's a little short of perfection. And they do expose technical debts to make sure that the pains and challenges are kept visible. As far as measurement, we already discussed how employee happiness is something they value quite heavily. And they do use hypothetical driven development to decide where they're going to place their bets. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that estimates and requirements really are just guesses. We know already that at least 50%, maybe even more, the number varies, of the features that we invest our time in are rarely, if ever, used by our customers. So we want to be able to eliminate that waste. This represents an ongoing investment of time just in maintenance that can extend into sometimes millions of dollars. So how do we trim that? Well, we align based on usage. We talked earlier about the definition of awesome. They try to get that minimum viable product out the door as soon as they can and see, do our customers favor this or not? Commonly, we see enterprises struggle with this, that there is no meaningful feedback loop built in on day one for the customer. The other thing is trying to gold plate a feature that may end up being a bad bet. Our guess, as far as what was of value to the customer, ended up being wrong. So this is the way that hypothesis-driven development, for instance, works at Microsoft. This is how we phrase things with every story that we create. With a hypothesis, here's how we're going to prove it, and then on this date, we're going to be able to either these metrics will show if we're winning or not. This is something as well that this chart below, the delivery pipeline, comes from Amazon, but they simply said DevOps is any efficiency that speeds up that feedback loop, that life cycle. So hypothetical driven development, a very big tool in our DevOps toolbox. They also make sure that their employees have 10% free capacity for, they call it hack time. Elsewhere, we see it as high as 50%. And they make sure, we already discussed this, but blame-free postmortems, they invest quite heavily in agile coaches. Spotify doesn't believe in doing more with less. They invest extremely heavily into making sure that their agile process as far as developing software is top-notch. They do more with more. That is another common quality of many successful DevOps enterprises. And I do love that. People are never the root cause of problems. Many of the things that Spotify values, we also find elsewhere. So that is the Spotify world in terms of DevOps practices. Hope you've enjoyed this. We're going to move on tomorrow into discussing Microsoft's innovations when it comes to self-forming teams and the BTE ratio. Thank you for joining.